Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth lecture in this series, Introduction to Medieval Armenian Poetry. I actually forgot to record this lecture when I was giving it live, so I'm recording it a few days later, and I'll do my best to be as natural as possible. Well, this lecture is entitled Biblical Epic, Grigor Magistros, Nersess Shnorhali, and Arakel of Sywnik. So there are three major biblical epics in medieval Armenian literature. What is a biblical epic? Well, we're defining this as a work that takes the Bible or a major portion of the Bible or a certain portion of the Bible as its subject matter and writes a poetic epic based on that material. The three major epics in Armenian, the first is entitled by the translator Abraham Tyrion, Magnalia Dei, or the Mighty Acts of God, based on the first words that start the work, Medzen Chords Astvadzayin. Like many medieval works, this text does not seem to have had an official title. And so here the title was drawn by the translator from the initial words. In previous publications of this work, it was sometimes called Ar Manuche, Tu Manuche, based off a mistaken identification or mistaken spelling of the addressee of the text, Grigor Magistros' interlocutor of sorts, which we'll see together when we read the preface. And also, it was sometimes translated or published under the title Hazara Dolian, which means of 1,000 lines or 1,000-liner. And this is because the epic as a whole is about 1,000 lines, give or take, a few more than 1,000. Grigor Magistros lived in the 11th century. We'll look a little bit at his life in just a moment. The second major text is Jesus Vorti, Jesus the Son, which was written actually by the great-grandson of Grigor Magistros, who was Catholicos Nersess Shnorhali, who lived in the 12th century. And this text is about 4,000 or so lines long. The third text we'll look at is the Atam Kirk, the Book of Adam, by Arakel Syunetsi, who wrote it at the very beginning of the 15th century. And this one is longest of all, over 7,000 lines. As a point of comparison, Homer's Iliad is about 15,000 lines long, Dante's Divine Comedy about 14,000, Milton's Paradise Lost and Virgil's Aeneid are around 10,000 lines. Nersess Shnorhali also wrote an epic on his ancestral history, epic history of the descendants of Haik, Vibasanutun Haikazans, but it's not a biblical epic, so it's not classified here. And there's, of course, an oral epic tradition in Armenian, the works that, the cycles that go under the title Sasnad Zerer, or Sasunsi David, the daredevils of Sassoon, or David of Sassoon. What's interesting is those were actually coalescing in coming together in the form we know them around this period. But those were all oral until the 19th century when they were written down. These, on the other hand, were composed as texts, written texts, not oral. Nersess Shnorhali also wrote Lament in verse, the Lament on Edessa, which we're going to look at in the next series. So he's come up before and he'll come up again. Fortunately for the English language reader, all three of these texts have been translated into English. So Jesus the Son, which is one of the very popular works of medieval Armenian literature, especially pious or religious literature, this has actually been translated twice into English. The first translation was done by Jane Wingate, Jesus, Son, only begotten of the Father, a prayer by Nersess the Grace-Filled, published in 1947. That was subsequently translated by Misha Kudyan under the title Jesus the Son in 1986. Michael Stone translated Adam Kirk, the Adam Book of Arakel of Sywnik, published by Oxford Press in 2007, in a very beautiful poetic translation. Michael Stone is himself a poet, and so the translation is particularly pleasing. Abraham Tyrion's Magnalia Dei, which I mentioned before, Biblical History and Epic Verse by Grigor Magistros, also includes an excellent introduction on the literary biblical epic tradition in Armenian, and I'll be drawing on some of that in the course of this lecture. So what about the origins of this genre, just in general? Well, Christian biblical epic goes back to the early Christian period, late antiquity. And the important context here is that it really has to be read as Christian competition with pagan epic, specifically Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid in the Latin world. Christian writers, beginning around the 4th century, began to feel somewhat embarrassed even of the fact that the Bible was not written in a grand, high style. In fact, Augustine in his Confessions writes about how the vulgar or common sort of language or style that the biblical texts were written in the Latin version that he was reading from did not appeal to him on literary grounds in the way that the texts of Virgil or Cicero or other classical Latin texts appeal to him. And so in order to sort of put Christian material into a literary high style in a way that could was meant to stand head to head or toe to toe with the texts of Homer or Virgil, you can see these figures on the screen began to put biblical texts into epic verse. And what's significant about most of these is that they were written in hexameter, which was the meter of Homer and the meter of epic. And so some of the early examples of biblical epic from the Greek and Latin world, Juvencus wrote a 4-book hexametrical epic on the 4 Gospels, Evangeliorum Libri Quatuor, in the 4th century, and this is the earliest witness of the biblical epic tradition. Also in the early period, a Christian paraphrase of the Psalms, so putting the Psalms into hexametric verse, traditionally attributed to Apollinaris the Younger, who was a 4th century bishop, and there's some dispute that this text maybe comes from about 100 years later in the 5th century. Then there was a 5th century, again, hexametric paraphrase of the Gospel of John by Nonus of Panoplis in the 5th century, writing in Greek. Also in the 5th century, but writing in Latin, Sedulius Coelius, a paraphrase of the 4 Gospels. And he meant to, in another work, Pascale Carmen, meant to provide a Christian counterpart to Virgil's Aeneid. Again, using the same verse that Virgil used, because that was the verse form for epic. And that shows the very direct way in which these authors are putting their texts in that tradition or against that tradition in competition with it. George of Pisidia in the 7th century wrote a hexameron in iambic trimeter, and this treated the 6 days of creation, drawing from material from earlier biblical commentaries, such as those by Basil of Caesarea, Gregory Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, etc. And this work was actually translated into Armenian also, or in the 8th century, by Stepanos Shunetsi in the early 8th century. And Grigor Magistros likely knew that work in translation. He was very familiar with the whole library of Armenian literature translated from Greek. Well, to summarize, all of these texts are written to kind of give a Christian response to, or a Christian version of, epic literature that's meant to compete with the Greek and Latin pre-Christian pagan epics such as Homer and Virgil. Well, there's also a tradition of later medieval epics that starts in the Christian East. And these arise not from competition with pagan literature anymore, but competition with the new dominant power on the scene, which is Islam, and specifically the Quran. And Grigor Magistros is one of our first authors to write out of that context. And the preface to his work gives an excellent image, a beautiful image of that kind of competition that there was. It's also significant that in terms of form, Grigor Magistros' epic is modeled off of Arabic verse form, not Greek or Latin. He also adopts rhyme, rhyme being the quintessential poetic device of Arabic, different from traditional Armenian, as well as Greek and Latin poetic devices. Let's say a few words about Grigor Magistros before taking a brief look at his text. So he lived in the 11th century, and he was from the Pahlavuni Siragan family. And this family was significant. It was a princely family, and they made claims to Parthian ancestry, and not just Parthian ancestry, but Parthian royal ancestry. They claimed in part of their family to be descended from the Arsacid kings of Armenia, as well as the early Gregorid bishops, so Saint Gregory the Illuminator and his descendants, and also the Mamigonians. So those are essentially the three biggest families or dynasties around the Christianization of Armenia. And so his family had the most illustrious ancestral lineage that one could boast of in the time period. He himself kind of became a father of leaders of the Armenian Church, of Catholicos. So his son became Catholicos. Two great-grandsons of his did. Two great-great-grandsons and a great-great-great-grandson. And these are essentially the many of the Catholicoi during the Gilikian Cilician period, from the mid-11th century to the very beginning of the 13th century. He received the very best of Byzantine education available at the time, as Armenian education and also in Greek letters. He gives a very complex interpretation of the Armenian version of the Techne Grammatike of Dionysius Thrax, and his vast learning and erudition is evident in his epistolary of 87 letters, which reflects his love of theology and philosophy, grammar and philology, rhetoric and poetry. And these letters are addressed to students of his as well as other dignitaries of the time. And really very complex language, lots of references to ancient Greek and other sort of figures. The Magistros title was a title of Byzantine administration that was conferred upon him. He had an administrative, high-ranking administrative position over the regions of northern Mesopotamia, southern Armenia, in the later 11th century after the Bagratid and other Armenian princes had ceded their kingdoms to the Byzantine Empire. He exemplifies very well what we were talking about in the very first lecture of this series, which is that prose texts, scholarly sort of texts and works, draw on Greek and Syriac models in Armenian, by and large. And you see this in his epistolary as well as his commentary on grammar. By contrast, most literary poetic works come from a more Arabic or Persian cultural matrix. And so this is exactly the case with Grigor Magistros. His book of poetry, as we're saying, responds to Arabic poetry, specifically the Quran. His epic is a concise retelling of the entire Bible in verse that also includes the spread of Christianity to Armenia. It's written in a verse form, as I was mentioning, that's called kafiya. And this is two half lines put together called hemistiches, separated by a caesura, or a break in the middle, and with rhyme at the end of the verse. And what was the rhyme he chose? Every single line in his epic ends in in, I-N, in. And that was not accidental. Of course, it's convenient for Armenian in the sense that you can have both nouns and verbs that end in in, so you get more flexibility with that ending. Secondly, that's the most common rhyme in Arabic. And so once again, it shows how it's reflecting the Arabic literary background that it's responding to. So let's look at this fascinating preface he wrote to see the immediate context in which the work is coming from, as in competition with Arabic scripture. Well, this is what I was mentioning before, and here you can see the contents of the work on the screen, the line numbers and the different material treated. And so you can see it goes through, as I was mentioning, most of biblical history, and then at the very end, early Christian history, and with a more pronounced focus on the spread of Christianity to Armenia. So here's the preface. In the year 494 of the Armenian era, which is AD 1045, I, Grigor Magistros, the son of the god-protected Vasag, the Pahlavuni leader and duke, was in the god-protected city of Constantinople during the reign of the pious and Christ-crowned emperor Constantine Monomachos. So he's in the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. There we happened to meet a Hagarian man, meaning descendant of Hagar, which is in Arab, named Manazi, very knowledgeable in Ishmaelite learning, that is Arabic letters, Arab and Persian letters, perhaps. Illustrious in every academic discipline, versed in epic recitation and rhetoric, and accomplished in poetry. We must honestly admit that he was distinguished and highly esteemed for composing encomia and works in Homeric and Platonic meter and verse. To this day, he receives yearly awards and gifts from the caliphs of Egypt and Babylon for his poetry, and Byzantine emperors have bestowed on him lavish honors, from the lowest order to that of proconsul. And this Manazi is a definite known historical figure. Abraham Tyrion, in his introduction, identifies him as Abu Nasr al-Manazi, a vizier and emissary of the Abbasid Caliphate, a theologian and poet who frequently visited Constantinople in quest of Greek scientific manuscripts. His mission was part of this ongoing effort of the Caliphate to acquire and translate Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic, And so naturally, he would have known that literature very well, known Greek very well as Arabic. Grigor Magistros continues and says, "For several days, this man was challenging us with rhetorical questions on all complexities and ingenious discoveries, and he did not cease to confront us with thought-provoking and ever-new conundrums. And when he could neither mask something nor confront with inexplicable things, he would stagger like one injured while running, very much like a child hopping here and there, running with exhaustion when playing games, like juggling apples." And so you see these two men from different cultural and religious backgrounds, but both the educated elite of their generation are engaging in debate and dialogue, probably taking place in Greek. He then ventured into the highest mystery, criticizing our evangelists that they did not set the Gospels in beautifully fitting and balanced words, in rhythmic verse and rhyming lines, or in the form of encomium expressing high praise. He went on to deride our Bible, saying, "Your Psalter and Scriptures are neither adequate nor a whole book, but a compilation of a sort." And here you see two of the major critiques leveled against the Christian scriptures by Muslim polemicists and others in this period and an earlier period, that the Quran is a superior scripture to the Christian Bible because it's more beautiful in rhyme, in verse, in poetry, a text whose form fits its content, whereas the Christian scriptures are in common language and not so beautiful or striking or stunning in terms of their language. Also, that the Christian scriptures were compiled and composed over thousands of years by multiple authors and kind of cobbled together into one book. It doesn't all seem to go together or fit together. There's things that don't seem to make sense on the surface. And so these are some of the very common critiques that were leveled against the Christian scriptures and that are well represented here in the preface. And he kept extolling the Quran of the Muslims, magnifying and commending it, saying that it is a marvel greater than miracle. Whereas our Muhammad, in contrast to the scriptures, starting from Adam down to himself, narrated the whole thing with consistent rhyming of the lines quite mystically. And he was telling so many verses are in this letter and so many are in this particular letter, and he was telling how often the same endings recur. We claim no one nowadays could create or reproduce even a single verse, for it is difficult to conceive and to sustain consistently the aforementioned rhyme, while it is not difficult for poets to theologize in a new way and on their own, logically and in a learned fashion, or to come up with an encomium in balanced verse. Such expression, however, flows with difficulty from the outset, whereas that of Muhammad was endowed by the Spirit, for he balanced these spiritual verses with identical rhyme. So what is Grigor going to do in response to this? He says, "Then, placing my hope in the Holy Spirit, in the Lord, the Creator and Sustainer, I began to say, it is neither through prophetic vision, nor through signs, nor through skill, but that the poetry of the Arabs, as in the course of ordinary speech, tends to end the lines with rhyme, which you call qafiya." And it's true. It's, as I mentioned earlier, rhyme is kind of the native poetic device of Arabic, and it's actually from Arabic that rhyme spread to all the Western languages, including English and other Western European languages that employed rhyme. Armenian was one of the early languages to adopt this from the Arabs. If you wish to consider this kind of prophetic revelation that took your Muhammad 40 years to write, I could put it in lines for you in 4 days, beginning from Adam until the second coming of his creator. Moreover, I could write it for you in lines ending with that magnificent rhyme of the letter noon which you were praising. And he kept betting many a time you couldn't do it. So this is Grigor Magistros's bet or boast that he could compose an abbreviated history of the Bible in this same verse and Arabic meter, like what the Quran, many parts of the Quran are written in, and that he could do it in just 4 days. And he did it. After writing it in 4 days, by the grace of God, having freed myself from everything, I began to read it in his presence. Thereupon he was astounded, greatly amazed, and choking with stutter, he asked, "By what skill were you able to write this book so expertly and quickly?" In my truthfulness, I said, "When we Christians resort to prayer, the Holy Spirit comes to our aid and teaches us the whole truth." And he confessed with fear and trembling that the God of the Christians is great. Because of this confrontation, I dared to write this, since they praise the Quran very highly, esteeming it on account of the kafiyya. Now, you students of rhetoric, write my memorial in this document, and remember me, Grigor, the God-protected Pahlavuni leader and duke, in prayer. And may the Lord grant you the grace of his mercy. Amen. So, while every detail of this preface and this kind of maybe it's even a literary conceit with which this document starts may not all be historically accurate and literal. However, it's very conceivable that Grigor Magistros knew this Almanazi. They were in Constantinople, very likely could have been at the same time. They moved in the same circles. It's not uncommon or difficult to imagine at all that they could have met and engaged in just such a confrontation and dialogue as this. So it very well could be true. Absolutely, he wrote this out of this sense of competition or a way of responding to these kind of typical Muslim remarks against the Christian scriptures, and in an effort to counter that claim that the Quran is inimitable by producing something that could compare with it. Of course, Grigor Magistros's work doesn't come close to the beauty or length or power of the Quran, but still it's a way of making a response to this claim. The work is also, as Abraham Tyrion writes in the introduction, can be understood as an apologetic for the Christian faith in its scriptures, and certainly was intended to deter the author's co-religionists, meaning other Armenians, from conversion to Islam. Certainly, among the multiple reasons the author had for writing this epic, some were to fulfill his own intellectual interests and spiritual needs, but certainly those of his own community, who at this time and in this general period, it was very tempting for purposes of upward mobility or other religious, social, theological reasons to be tempted to convert to Islam at this time. And so we should also see the text as a kind of apologetic aimed at the Armenian community. So let's look just at the very opening of the text to see what the meter is like and what the poetry is like of this text. So these are the first 10 lines. Medzen kortsk astvadzayin, iskanchali norapanin, harashali anbatmelin, hamenaini zarmanalin, einvornusti herkines hergnits, I partrutun seropein, Lusov inknamaduits, Baradzadskial an kanelin, Tasuk an marmanagan, Ortnapanyal an jarelin, Astelzo koit polor, vorkizadzuk vorkierevin. An mah yavan garod, kerov peit an pavelin. Anaskispen an jamanag, yavadaroch pavidanin. An kan yavan sahman, der amenain yesraganin. Aner an jamanag, zair amenain zairakunin. So you can see the half lines, usually 7 syllables in the first half and 8 in the second half, and the rhyme in, all the way down. This is Abraham Tyrion's translation. Mighty are the acts of God, wondrous his word, marvelous the indescribable, in all things admirable. He who dwells in the heights of heaven above the seraphim, enclosed in his own light, shrouded as the unsearchable. By ranks incorporeal, the ineffable is praised, the maker of all things visible and invisible. Immortal and self-sufficient, beyond the compass of the cherubim, without beginning, eternal, creator of ages, limitless, beyond bound, Lord of the entire universe, uncreated, eternal, transcendent above all. And it goes on and on and on with these epithets, which is very like, in fact, the beginning of an Arabic work, and also betrays the kind of Arabic literary context in which it was written. Let's look at one other example. This is from near the end of the work when he's getting to the narration of the conversion of Armenia to Christianity, just to see a sort of example when he's talking about Saint Gregory the Illuminator, who, again, as you remember, he was named after, and who also he claims to be a descendant from. Gamim as kezasel harach konzais as bartavin, as surpuin mer krikori, yev as hayot lusavorchin. Ka kavan balhavin, yev as ki ashagunin. As makur hairabedin, yev zaskanchali mardirosin. Jeshmarid arakorin, sa arakel estramanin. Markare es sa desorin, yev usutsich mero azkin. Yeritz hankitz amatz charcharelo ichor kapin. Pazum kan zeis harach, zor gerial inken ihuving. I kalin der tada, hezer keduin vor kail gochin. Zelen nashanok, zer talini hrom hedar kain. Is kalin yevis cena trilin, I rebonte badriarkin. Is pedelen atana kinya, yev is serpo garabedin. Zerial nashananin, zor ararial hashti shadin. Here I would tell you of the Parthian who preceded him, our own Saint Gregory, the illuminator of Armenia, a citizen of Pahlav and from the dynasty of the Arsacids, undefiled patriarch and glorified martyr, true to the sender, this apostle of his commandment, prophet and seer and teacher of our nation, for 15 years was tormented in a deep dungeon. This happened long before he made his way to meet Tiridates at the river called Gile. The wonders that followed, the journey to Rome with the king, the return and the consecration by Leontius, the patriarch, the bringing of the relics of Athenogenes and of the Holy Messenger, and the miracle that took place at Ashdishat. And it goes on and on from there, but that's all the time that we have to spend on Grigor Magistros and his epic. Definitely most interesting of all about that work is the preface that shows the kind of encounter with the Muslim intellectual interlocutor, out of which context the text was written, and a new genre was ushered into Armenian literature, that of literary biblical epic. And it would be Grigor Magistros' great-grandson, Saint Nersess Shnorhali, who would write the next great biblical epic. Um, Saint Nersess Shnorhali, we've talked about a little bit before, and we'll talk about him a little bit more next time as well. But just briefly, he lived through most of the 12th century. You see his dates on the screen. Catholicos from 1166 to 1173. And he was the author of many works in poetry and prose. I mentioned some of his other well-known poetic works earlier. Jesus Vorti is over 4,000 lines, and it also employs the same rhyme and in throughout most of the text. There is a little bit of variety. What's significant about his text is he kind of combined the approach of Grigor Magistros by taking by writing a literary biblical epic, but he brought to it also the literary and spiritual sensibility of Gregory of Nodeg, which we looked at last time, the penitential poetic approach, with its very personal approach to the biblical material. So where, as you could see in Grigor Magistros' text, it's very like zoomed out, kind of written from afar, from a detached, almost like bird's eye view or perspective, very objective, or more objective, kind of distant narration. Nersess Shnorhali's text is just the opposite. It's just as personal as we saw in the kind of poetry, and as you see in the kind of penitential poetic works like those of Gregory of Nodeg and the prayer book attributed to Ephraim the Syrian. So he's going to be talking about biblical events and figures, comparing himself to them, writing it not just in the third person, but also the first person. And so let's look at an example from that. So this is the very beginning of his text. Jesus vorti hor miadzin, yev jarakait gerbaranin, zanunt anjad iskaspanada bin, anhadapad kum zanorin, horme yerialkas nedkortzin, imanalik vorkierevin, marmin yerialkas yev an marmin, an panagank hanterts panin, gentanagank vor pusanin, yev an gentank vor vot sharjin, Horots ant hod cum sirorin, kes kohutunk madutsanin. Yev ant hoquit cum eaktin, paradrutunk verarakin. Ihundrelots makrakunits, vork ant hargav komutzanin. Angal yev zister, ant namin, estunkanores batviranin. Esnamanores anaragin, yev zinches horet vatnorin. Sie ken badiven an kidorin, yevhavasar kol an madin. Itivatzen akaragin, zeram chozitzen arazorin. Sovetzeluin voch sovhatzin, elisalo diarnet panin. Tsangatzelo cherm yachcherin, kachtsen meratz tarnakunin. And here's Misha Kudian's translation. Jesus, the only begotten Son of the Father, and the splendor of his countenance, thou ineffable offspring of the archetype, inseparable from thy begetter, thou by whom all beings are created, the conceivable that can be seen, the disembodied and the embodied, the irrational as with the rational, the living things that grow, and the lifeless that do not move. All these offer thanksgiving unto thy loving Father and unto thee, and unto thy coexistent Spirit are proffered exaltations on high from the elect ones most pure that are admitted unto thine abode. And now you see it gets personal. Receive me also with them, O Lord, I who have disobeyed the commandment, I who am like unto the prodigal son and the waster of thy father's goods, who ignored the honor that came from thee and became the equal unto the brainless one, that put the whole herd of swine to graze in the very field of demons. I who am famished, not of hunger for bread, but to hear thy word, O Lord, being ardent with a desire for cherubs, in the bitterness from the delight of sins. So yes, as I was saying, you can see here the kind of, it's not just biblical narration, but the person puts himself into it in a very penitential spirit, not unlike the approach of Gregory of Nottingham. I want to look again at the colophon. So we looked in the first or second lecture at this colophon that was written by Nersess Shnorhali, which shows direct competition, this time not only with the Arab world, but with the gusans, the traditional minstrel singers, the bards of that go back to pre-Christian times in Armenia and pre-Christian oral literature. And Nersess Shnorhali was also writing in competition with them and composing some of his works to try to replace their popularity. In fact, in the introduction to his prayer of 24 stanzas, Havadov Chostovanim, with faith I confess, one of the famous prayers of the Armenian Church, he says that he meant for this to be memorized by the people, who he's so disappointed with his people. They pray so little, but they have all these songs known from the gusans, from the pagan minstrel singers. And remember, as I was mentioning, poetry itself, up until St. Nersess Shnorhali's time, was very much viewed as kind of belonging to or in the sphere of the gusans, the pagan pre-Christian Armenian literature. And in his colophon to this work, we can see Nersess Shnorhali indicating a kind of anxiety or anticipating objections that he thinks might come to his work because he's using poetry, which at this time is still in Armenia viewed as being a kind of like pagan form or genre. So listen to what he says. He says, "And let no one be mortified by the fact that these words are written in verse, and let him not consider them profane like unto the song of Aphrodite. For if falsehood by pretending becometh so beautiful thereby, then how eloquent indeed become the words of truth that are herein." So he's saying, don't blame me just because I'm using the kind of poetic language and form that is used for pagan pre-Christian works. "It is in the manner of the Song of Solomon, that is known as the Song of Songs, that the love of the celestial bridegroom waketh within the virgin bride, or else like unto the Psalms of David, of the prophet, who drove away the evil spirit, and who, after Samuel had anointed him, sang through the Spirit on a 10-stringed harp. Or yet unto many others who are known, and who made use of rhymed verse, not of their own accord, but through the Spirit, that moveth whomsoever it desireth, so that the rich may not be thought poor, and the generous may not be called mean." So he's saying it's not just that poetry is the purview of pagan authors, pagan singers, but in our own scriptures, in our own Christian literature, Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, New Testament, we have poetry there too. The Psalms, the Song of Solomon. I'm writing inspired by the same spirit that inspired them. He goes on, "Likewise, favors are not limited to one being, but are distributed amongst very many. Some are granted the favor of clean words, that public orations may be beneficial. Others to grasp the hidden meaning of sermons, in order to wake the sleeping soul. Some are given words that are not rhymed, but are powerful and in regular order. Yet others are granted the words of poetry, that the mind may be opened thereby. For our nature is indeed manifest. We quickly grow satiated and wearied. And for this reason, a language is given many different varieties of speech. In the same manner, I likewise wrote my discourse in verse on paper, for the enjoyment of the man of letters and of the benevolent reader. Wherefore, with the love of your hearts, consider ye worthy to remember me, that I may be rewarded with deliverance by the generous Lord gratuitously." Very, very fascinating. He talks about here how he's well aware of how the human mind works, how we get tired and bored of the same thing. We get tired and bored of dry things. And so he's saying, I'm trying to write in a way that's appealing to the popular people and give them material that would be appealing to a wide audience, not just kind of the literary elite and intellectuals. And we see this actually as a feature of Nersess Shnorhali's works in general, and it's probably for that reason that he became so popular. He also wrote riddles, he wrote popular prayers, he wrote many sharakans, and some other poetic works, some of which we'll look at, one of which we'll look at next time. But let's conclude by spending just a few minutes looking at Arakel of Sywnik, this third great literary biblical epic. Arakel of Sywnik lived in the late 14th and early 15th century. His mother was Saint Gregory of Datev's brother, Grigor Datovatsi's sister, obviously. Grigor Datovatsi's sister was Arakel of Sywnik's mother. So Arakel studied at the renowned monastic schools of Gladzor and Datev under Hovannes Vorotnetsi and his uncle, St. Gregory of Datev. So these were the two best monastic schools of the time and essentially the two best teachers of the era. And so he had the very best education you could get at that period. He was a skilled poet, musician, scribe, and illuminator. There's several manuscripts of him that are known to have been copied by him, illuminated by him. He also has other poetic works besides the Adam Kirk you can see on the bottom, the Book of Paradise, Tadachta Kirk. This is a text that takes as its subject matter the afterlife, and the protagonist is the author, and he kind of guides the reader through the infernal and supernal regions. And this work has been compared to Dante's Paradise Lost, to Dante's Divine Comedy. Milton's Paradise Lost is compared with the Adam Kirk, the Book of Adam, or the other way around, because this Adam Kirk takes the story of Adam and Eve, and especially the fall, as its subject matter. And the Adam Kirk is actually a kind of collective name given to three long, distinct poems that Arakel Syunetsi wrote, all between the years 1401 and 1404. The first one written was actually Adam Kirk 3, which is 928 lines. The second one written was Adam Kirk 1, 5,498 lines. And the third one written was 828 lines. All were kind of somewhat different works, somewhat individual works that take a slightly different take and approach to the same subject matter, and together kind of can be read as one larger book. And as I mentioned, Michael Stone of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was the translator of this text, and it's a wonderful, beautiful translation. As I mentioned, he himself is a poet in English and has a very fine ear for language. And he specifically says that he did this translation in order to give English-speaking readers a way to appreciate the literary beauty of this text. He wasn't concerned first and foremost with philological or historical, theological sort of questions. He thought this is a great work of literature that deserves to be better read and better known by a wide audience. Arakel Syunetsi is not even that even as prominent as he should be in Armenian literature. He's not even known as much by Armenians or even in Armenian studies as well or as prominently as perhaps he should be. Mercifully, his text does not all just take the same rhyme in, but he introduces different rhymes, different endings in the work, and for that reason alone, it kind of makes it more interesting and enjoyable to read. So this is a passage from section 14 where Adam and Eve are kind of reflecting on what they lost after the fall in exile. And so I chose this selection just to get a taste of this text by Orakos Yunetsi. So first we'll read the Armenian and then close by reading the English. Այժմ ուր է թրախտն իմ ցանկալի, ուր է իմ լույսն կերարփի, որքան հիշեմ հոգիս մաշի, եւ մորմոքի սիրտս իփորի, ով լույս անջար իմ ցանկալի, իքո սիրուիտ միտքս ցնցի, հոգիս վարյալ մարմինս հալի, ուշս քնացյալ քեզ դակնաբի, քեզ փախցալովս բդուղն արի, Աստվածությանդ քո ցանկայի, թեպետ փարածն այն ոչ հասի, բայց նույն սիրով են հոգիս վարի, աչք իմ հարյալ գա հարդասուս, սիրտ իմ քոչե հարաճակույնց, աղե հոգվույս մասունց, արցանգալիտ իմի պարծունց, հիմա ես ինչ արնեմ անջար, այնքան փարած կամավ զրկյալ, Փոշիմանիմ դարագուսյալ, կսկծամահ աղեկիսյալ, եթե ննչեմ ոչ հանդարդիմ, և թե հարնեմ պնավ չհանգչիմ, իլուր գալով հույժ դակնաբիմ, և ընդխոսալս խոցոդիմ, այլ ազգ սիրով չմխիթարիմ, զաշխարս հոչինչս համարիմ, անդի պարոք ես ոչ հակիմ, զի անջար իմ ցանկալին. Now where is my desired paradise? Where is my most luminous light? As often as I remember, my soul is exhausted, and my heart laments in my belly. O undying light, my desired one, my mind is crazed by love of you. My soul is inflamed, my body melts, my mind is gone, it craves painfully for you. Through yearning for you, I took the fruit. I desired your divinity. Although I did not achieve that glory, yet my soul is inflamed by the same love. My eyes are shedding tears, my heart cries out for my former things. The parts of my soul beseech you, my desired one on high. Now what shall I, the deficient one, do, having purposely despoiled myself of such glory? I repent in doubts, deathly pained, broken-hearted. If I sleep, I am not assuaged, and if I arise, I have no repose. Remaining silent, I am greatly distressed, and when I speak, I am tormented. I am not comforted by another kind of love. I reckon this world as nothing. I am not satisfied with worthless glory, for that which I desired was ineffable. Which bitterness of mine shall I lament, or on account of which thing shall I sigh? On account of the ineffable glory, or of being in the immortal's company. When I consider that which I desire, that Eden adorned with glory, my miserable bowels shrivel up, and my eyes are moved to tears. If the rejoicing of all things appears before my eyes, they cannot dissipate this sadness from my mind. So very powerful language, very beautifully translated into English. One of the things I found striking about this passage was Adam and Eve. It's not mentioned that, they did what they did out of rebellion or disobedience against God, but rather out of desire for God. They were longing for divinity. They were longing for God. and pursuing their love of God, pursuing their love, but just in the wrong way at the wrong time. And that's such a more nuanced and sophisticated picture of sin than one often hears. And this is just one of the many kind of beautiful and rich and thought-provoking things that you can find in the Adam Kirk of Arakel Syunetsi. And Michael Stone really did it justice with his English translation, which hopefully will be known to many more readers. So thank you so much for your attention. Next week, we're going to look at laments, public laments, poetic laments written on the fall of cities. So after the capture of cities, a series of laments were written. And the first one we'll look at is by Nersess Shnorhali, the lament on the fall of Edessa, written during Crusader times. And so we'll see you next week for that lecture. Thank you so much.